Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm Alan Murray, the CEO of Fortune. Give me a show of hands if you can hear me. Just want to make sure great. Thank you. Excited to have you with us for this conversation on the new ways to lead as we reimagine work in the pandemic and post-pandemic era. This event is being held in partnership with the Future Forum by Slack. We're going to hear from Brian Elliott of the Future Forum in just a minute. It's an important topic. I think we all have learned in the last 9 months that the way you lead when everyone is working from home is pretty dramatically different from how you do it in the office. And many of those changes are going to continue once the pandemic passes. And as we move into a world of hybrid work, there'll probably be new challenges. It was interesting to read this morning that Google has now told its staff they're not coming back until September. And when they do come back, you only have to be there 3 days a week. But apparently you can choose the 3 days you're there. Raises all sorts of interesting questions about how we design work and make work effective in the world ahead. I think particularly important, and this is the topic we really want to bear down on today, is the question of mid-tier management and how they steer their teams and what tools and what help they need to steer their teams most effectively. And that's going to be a big part of our conversation. It's a great group. We've kept it small because we really want everyone to participate. If you can, please put your camera on so we can see that you're there, and please join the conversation. You can do that by putting comments in the chat, excuse me, not the Slack. I will keep an eye on the chat if you have something to add, something you want to ask. And so feel free to use that vigorously. But to get us started, Brian, let me turn to you first. And you've been doing a lot of research and a lot of thinking about this topic. And I wonder if you could give us some thoughts to get us going.
Thanks, Alan. I'm Brian Elliott. I lead the Future Forum. We're a new consortium backed by Slack, digging into both the experiences that people are having in this remote work world, but also talking with a lot of different companies about habits and practices, experiments they're running, things they're trying, and what their teams are wrestling with. One of the things I thought I'd share with you today that's really pertinent to the topic is we dug into the results of our Remote Employee Experience Index, a research piece that we did with 9,000 knowledge workers around the globe. We dug into different experiences people were having from different backgrounds, different challenges that people having across the board. But one that stood out for us strongly was middle managers. So when we cut the data by the responses from middle managers versus senior executives and individual contributors, those middle managers were feeling the stress of remote work more than either of those other two groups. And that's true across core areas like their sense of belonging at work and their assessment of their own productivity. From a belonging perspective, there's really sizable differences. So belonging overall was like the single biggest issue in our survey results. Everybody is wrestling with that sense of social isolation. How do I feel like I'm part of a team? But when we compared results, middle managers were way below individual contributors or senior execs in their sense of belonging at work. When you look at it against senior executives as well, a couple of other bits stood out to us. When we asked people, is it easier or harder for you to maintain relationships in a remote work setting? Middle managers were 91% more likely to say they were struggling to maintain those relationships. And only 63% of them felt like they could count on their colleagues to support them versus over 90% for senior executives. Now, some of this clearly goes to the fact that middle managers don't have the networks that senior executives have already established. But given that lack of network, it's even more challenging for them to feel like they've got, the support that they need to make their team successful as well as be successful themselves. The other place that stood out was their assessment of their own productivity. So middle managers, overall productivity in our study, like a lot of others, was positive, meaning people working remotely felt like they were more productive, even accounting for things like extra hours, than they had been working in an office environment. But middle managers were sizably below, like 36% below individual contributors. But when you look at it versus senior executives and try to diagnose what's going on, a couple of interesting findings. First of all, these are the folks that are struggling with meeting burnout the most, meaning they're 51% more likely to say they're spending too much time in meetings. And only 61% of them say they can manage their workload versus 80% plus for senior executives. One of the biggest things, in fact, that we hear them saying that they report back in our survey that they're struggling with is staying on top of my team's workload and understanding what's going on. So this isn't a new phenomenon that middle managers are feeling the squeeze, but they're feeling it even more in this, remote work environment. We're already grappling with the fact that middle managers are struggling, whether they're in companies that are more scientific management based, measure by attendance. Clearly that's hugely challenging. Or they're in companies that are more progressive and thinking about how do I lead with purpose. But this challenge of trying to take people who are sort of newer to the job of management, putting them in a remote setting and say, be productive and get your teams cohesively moving together is a deep challenge and one that's not going away for us for a while. So we thought it'd be helpful to pull a group together and have a conversation about it today.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. And very helpful data as well, really underscores some of the problems and challenges that this group has faced. We have a fabulous panel to dig deeper into these topics. Let me introduce them quickly, and then we'll talk a little bit with each of them and then get to a discussion with the full group. Raj Chowdhury is an associate professor at Harvard Business School. Raj, raise your hand there so everybody sees you. Yep, good. Jenny Johnson, President and Chief Executive Officer of Franklin Templeton Investments. Jenny, great to have you here. A little disturbed to see the sun setting so early, but I'll figure it out. And Darren Murph, who is head of remote. Love the title, Darren, at GitLab. I'm going to ask Raj to go first because, like Brian, he has some interesting research to present. It was just published in the Harvard Business Review, but on the off chance that not all of you have read it, I'm going to ask him to summarize what he found.
Thank you, Alan. Thanks for having me. So I've been studying remote work for about 4 years now, and most of my research actually was done prior to the pandemic. So it's probably more reflective of what to expect once we come out of it. And just as a context, I've studied remote work in both very large organizations, such as the US Patent Office, but also relatively small but cutting edge, all remote companies such as GitLab. So Darren is a good friend for years now. And the form of remote work that I study and I'm personally most passionate about is what I call work from anywhere. And that's just not work from home. It is giving employees the flexibility to live wherever they want to live. So it's work from anywhere. So this article, which is the cover story of the HBR, the current version of the magazine, talks about two things at a high level. So first, I build a case for CEOs and boards to embrace work from anywhere. And the 3 or 4 main benefits I talk about for why work from anywhere should be the future of work are the following. So the first and the most important reason is it really expands the search for talent, because now you're not constrained by immigration, you're not constrained by dual careers, you're not constrained by the economics of living in expensive locations like Silicon Valley or New York, and you can find and retain talent in any part of the world. And for many, many decades, research shows how women especially have had to really forced to relocate and bear the brunt of dual careers. So that leads to the second important reason for embracing work from anywhere, which is inclusion. I believe this is an inclusive work policy which helps firms and organizations recruit from all kinds of geographies, but also equalizes gender, socioeconomic indicators of the talent pool, and so on. The third reason is productivity, which I actually find in an experiment at the US Patent Office, that productivity in the 2012-13 timeframe, when they implemented a work from anywhere, went up about 4.5%. And then finally, there's of course real estate savings, but to me, that is really low-hanging fruit, not the main reason. Yeah. And then the second part of the article, just very quickly, is how to do work from anywhere. And the bottom line there is this is truly an organizational transformation. You need to rethink your processes as they relate to everything, but specifically how you measure productivity, how you communicate, how you codify knowledge, how you socialize, how you do manage regulation of labor laws, and I'm happy to dig into how to work from anywhere later.
Yeah, I think we're going to want you to give some specifics, but let me just, before we go on, ask you about the issue that Brian raised at the top, was this challenge of sense of belonging. That after a period of time, people didn't feel the same connection to the group that they had felt in the office. Is that a problem, and what are the best ways to deal with it?
So, Alan, quick answer, because there are many voices here, and I would love to learn myself. But quick answer is actually the all remote model argues that you could socialize better in the remote world than the physical world, and I'll give you a very intuitive reason for that. So, in the physical world, we do have these serendipitous water cooler conversations, but think about who you have those conversations with, and they're probably people on the same floor of the building that you work. And that doesn't really embrace all organizational hierarchy or all locations. So the CEO rarely has water cooler conversations with the intern. In the remote world, on the other hand, someone in the company could really structure what I call these planned randomized interactions.
I'm going to stop you there for a second, Raj, and make you say that again, because it's a mind-blowing concept. Go ahead.
So I call them planned randomized interactions, and they're both planned and random because someone in the company has to schedule them. That's why they're planned, but they're random because you're drawing a random team from within the organization, cutting across hierarchy, cutting across functional groups, and cutting across geography. And then this team is just like us, talking about issues on Monday morning or Friday evening. And the last thing I'll say is that beyond those virtual water coolers, the best practice is to really physically locate for short bursts of time. So you can bring people together for a week. And if they know that's the only chance to meet their colleagues, they really show up, and they really show up with lots of presence. So in summary, water coolers, temporary co-location can really bond the organization.
Yeah, really interesting. On the planned random interaction front, we've been using a tool for some of our conferences where you have random networking, like 3.5 minutes with someone who you've never met before and is randomly connected with you. It's really interesting. It is, in fact, in some ways more effective than in-person networking, where you can often get stuck in a corner talking to somebody for a long, long time who maybe you didn't want to talk to for that long. Jenny, let me turn to you. You've been managing this now since the shutdown. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit what your experience has been like and what you've learned.
Well, first, I just want to reiterate a point Raj made, which is the virtual environment democratizes the interactions if people can plan that, because it's true. Executives sit on the executive floor, IT guys sit on the IT floor, and so that's a great opportunity if it's somehow planned. I would just say that COVID has accelerated a trend that already existed in work from home, just like it's accelerated e-commerce, just like it's accelerated telemedicine. The future post-COVID is going to look different, but the trend just, you kind of forced the hockey stick up. And so in that, I think on the tools, on the technology side, we all think we're all so hip because we're old and we use Zoom and the videos and it's all great. Well, the reality is that's barely scratching the surface of the real tools. I mean, Slack, Brian, with what Slack's doing that exists, but most people actually aren't using those. And some of them are clunky, like the virtual whiteboard, and some of them are really pretty good, but people haven't quite used them. So that becomes a people process issue. And that's where I think this next kind of level of breakthrough that's going to be very interesting. When I say that it's a trend that already exists, so Franklin Templeton, over 100 offices, 35 countries, and you could be a supervisor, say 7 layers down from the CEO, and have people reporting to you that are in 2 different or 3 different countries. So a lot of those technology tools existed the same way, existed that enabled this work from home. And what we found is that about, I don't know if it's a third, but some percentage of the population naturally found themselves able to work in that environment. Another percent of the population had to be kind of coached into figuring out how to work in that environment. And honestly, there was a percent of the population that ultimately, no matter what you could do, they just never got comfortable with it. They never got comfortable managing on results. They never got comfortable creating flexibility, redesigning your workflow to create flexible times so that people who are in a different time zone could manage to deliver. So, I think that's going to be the great opportunity, is understanding kind of what those skills are, what that training is, to be able to get the biggest portion of your workforce who are able to be good at it. And then just a couple lessons learned. It is the softer side, particularly as you go to that last mile where people are at home and not in hubs. And it's things that we found pretty successful. One of our subsidiaries does Friday, they're like Friday cocktails, but the CEO plays a guitar, or a different person performs, and they just use that sort of virtual time to get together. It has been amazingly effective. One of the things I think that middle managers, as you mentioned, they don't have that network. We've said to people on our management committee and our management team, we want you before the next meeting to reach out to 5 people you don't know virtually, right? Giving permission makes a huge difference on being able to build that network. And I think that has to come from top. So I'll stop there, Alan, with just a couple of those comments.
On that second one, that's really interesting. Is that reach out to 5 people within the company or anywhere?
Within the company. So yeah. And part of it is we actually did a major acquisition that doubled the size of the firm. We announced it 5 days before COVID hit. We did manage to close 60 days early. We actually done 4 acquisitions during COVID. And we actually think that there's some ways in which this became more effective in being able to get certain things done. You could lose some things, but there's also more effective. Yeah. For example, I can look at the 9 people on video and see how they respond in a way I couldn't capture all those visuals when you're in the room. So, there's good and bad of both. And that's why I think the future is truly a hybrid environment for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, good. We'll come back to some of that. Let me turn to Darren. Jenny set you up by talking about parties where the CEO plays the guitar, and you have at least 2 of them hanging in the background there. So if you decide to pull one out and play for us, we'll all be delighted. But you have the pretty unique honor of having the title head of remote. This is not new for you. You've been working on this for a while, but I wonder what lessons you've learned at GitLab on how to make remote work.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. So that's correct. I'm the head of remote at GitLab. This role appeared here long before the pandemic, and there was a recent T3 Advisors report that points to the surge in this role. In fact, I've helped some pretty sizable organizations articulate the job description around this role. It's very new, it's very different, but to Raj's point, much of what works in a successful remote transition only works if you put intentionality behind it. And this is a fundamental reality. If you invest in something, chances are it's going to do better. So if you're going to make a successful remote transition, you need to invest in it. And for many organizations, they'll find that you have to put someone in charge of it. Just adding it as a line item to the chief people officer or chief operations officer, you're probably going to find yourself stretched thin to some degree. So a few of the things that we've learned, the good news is we've documented everything that we've learned. So if you go to your favorite search engine and search for GitLab remote playbook, you'll find all of that documented. And it's part of who we are. We're a transparent open core company and we share all of our knowledge on that. But one thing that I want to tie back to Brian's earlier data on why middle managers feel so squeezed and how it relates to belonging. There is a physical component of belonging. GitLab gets the entire team together somewhere in the world once a year. Now, we couldn't do that in person for 2020, but we hope to resume that in 21 and beyond. In-person matters. Like Raj said, if you know you're only getting together once a quarter or once a year, you show up, you're present, it matters. But there's an element of belonging that is rarely talked about and is woefully missing from middle managers right now, and that is transparency. For many organizations, they were not set up to be transparent about how and where work happens. So now when you don't have an office, people recognize that there are communication gaps and silos. And when you can't see what other people are working on, you feel like you belong less. Because organizations are in real time grappling with how transparent can we be, what tools do we need so that we can be more transparent, belonging will come with transparency. GitLab is an incredibly transparent organization. It's very easy to look across any of our functions without tapping someone on the virtual shoulder and see what their OKRs are, see what their goals are, see what their progress and status updates are. This makes us feel like we belong to a team without actually spending time with the team. That's how important transparency really is to the belonging equation.
That's really interesting. Brian, I wonder if I can go back to you for a minute while we're on this belonging question, because there were a couple of interesting results from your research. One is the notion that middle managers felt less of a sense of belonging. And the other that I found fascinating was that underrepresented groups felt more of a sense of belonging at work from home than they did in the office. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on both of those points.
Yeah, so from a diverse groups perspective, one of the things that we measure in terms of that sense of belonging to your team was cutting it across different races and ethnicities. And while sense of belonging was negative overall on average for people working remotely, that was actually true largely for white employees. When we looked at Black employees, Latinx, Asian Americans in the States, they actually were feeling a positive sense of belonging working remotely. We've had some interesting conversations with a few experts and academics about this. And part of that potentially comes from code switching. So the cost of feeling like you have to, on a 9 to 5, 5 days a week in an office environment, continually code switch, and the burden that puts on people from sort of the not white, not majority background. And the ability for them to dial in, but also dial back out helps sort of level the playing field for people broadly. So that was really interesting in terms of how we balance it out. I would also second Darren's point about transparency. One of the key things that we found in the study was that teams that were sort of defaulting to open, meaning using more modern technologies, sharing content more freely, weren't struggling as much with that key middle management task of what's my team up to these days. People that were defaulting to meetings actually were the ones that were performing the worst.
Really interesting. I want to open it up in a minute, but Raj, before I do, let me ask you one more follow-up question on your research. As you said, it was all done before the pandemic hit. Do you think the pandemic has changed it in any ways other than simply the frequency and volume of remote work?
So I think, Alan, the acceleration clearly is what the pandemic has done, but I think it's also a double-edged sword, because as we've said, many companies were not prepared for this. So, but it's a great opportunity now, because people have experienced remote work maybe for the first time in many cases, and now in many cases people have actually moved away to a location which they would much rather live in. So the question really is how to get that how to remote work piece correct. So I just wanted to add, if I may, a quick observation on the transparency. So I had a fascinating experience working with this blue chip investment bank over the summer. And they had this internship program where it was done remotely, of course. And there were some interns who were returning interns. So they'd done it physically last summer, and this summer they were doing it remotely. And on that belonging and the inclusion piece, I interviewed many of these interns. And one woman said something really interesting. She was working on the trading floor. And last summer, she was, as in her words, she was jostling to observe what the trader did. But the boys were just occupying that space. But this summer, the senior trader just shared the Zoom screen. So it's that green button that you can just share, and everyone got to see the trader in action in real time. So it was much more inclusive. She felt included. She felt a much stronger attachment with the organization. So I think it's really the creativity and the management around all of these questions. There's nothing wrong with remote work per se. It's how you structured the practices and the habits.
Really interesting. Let me alert everyone to the fact that if you go into the chat now, you will have links to the Future Forum research, to Raj's HBR story, and also to GitLab's remote playbook. So it's all in there. Darren, did you have something else you wanted to add to the conversation, or does that?
I think Raj said it best. You really have to have executive sponsorship at the very top. And I think this actually also plays into some of that data on middle management being squeezed. there's only so much you can do to thrive as a remote worker and a remote manager without executive sponsorship. If your executives are not invested in auditing your tools, workflows, and processes and making them more remote inclusive, making them into remote first practices, they're stuck in between. They're stuck in between direct reports who are feeding back up that they need new ways of working and investment in these tools, workflows, and technologies and culture change. And if the executive sponsorship isn't there, there's only so much that can be done.
Yep. Tracy Laney, can I call on you? Introduce yourself and tell a little bit about how you're dealing with these challenges with your mid-tier managers.
Thanks so much, Ellen. Yeah, hi, I'm Tracy Laney. I'm the Chief HR Officer for Levi Strauss & Co. So we are based here in San Francisco, but offices all around the world and stores and distribution centers. And so I think it's one thing to start out by saying it's important to note that when we talk about remote work, we talk very carefully about our corporate workforce, right? Because we have a ton of essential workers, our frontline employees who've been in our distribution centers and in our stores almost this whole time. I mean, we get stores closed for a bit at the beginning, but have really been open globally. And if you think about a global company, China, closed abruptly and then has been pretty much up and running since, right? So I think that's also really important that we think about that. But we do have obviously a large corporate workforce. One fun fact about me is I started my job on March 23rd. So I have not been in the office. I look like I'm in an office now. This is a space I borrow near my house occasionally, but I've not been in my office once. So I've literally had the experience of onboarding remotely and virtually. So very much akin to what anyone in a work from anywhere place or just even during this pandemic has had to deal with. And we've had, at this point, hundreds of employees in my situation. So I totally agree with everything that's been said about middle management in particular. So one of the things that we realized, I think about these last 9 months in stages, right? The first stage was sort of adjust, right? And so it was quickly standing up all the remote tools. We use Microsoft Teams, like all the things you have to do to kind of adjust. And that actually, in hindsight, happened quite quickly, right? And I think we had a similar experience as some employees really embraced it, some struggled a bit more, but by and large was pretty successful in driving that productivity we've talked about. I think the second phase, and we probably are still in it, was really like, well, then how do we all make life work in this environment? And what we've been surveying our employees and they've told us is there is a ton of overload. There is a ton of burnout. There is a ton of just feeling like, all the stuff we all know about with Zoom fatigue, et cetera. And so we've really invested in these last several months on mental health and well-being, a key component of which is manager training. So we developed basically a 2-hour, pretty bite-sized, but deeply impactful, what we call manager reset, that we gave to all managers around the globe, anyone who's a people manager of any kind, really about leading with empathy, leading with connection, and finding ways to really understand. You actually now as a manager have to step up and understand, A, how to take care of yourself to the point of like they're struggling too, and then B, how to meet employees where they are so you can help this employee manage their childcare situation, this employee manage focus on objectives, et cetera, right? And just a sort of a higher order of deeply empathetic leadership that we are now put around the company. And so one of the things I would say as hopefully we look toward the future, watching people get vaccinated all day yesterday, which made me smile tremendously, is I think most of what we've done during this pandemic, we need to keep doing. The focus on remote work. We haven't said this publicly, but we're kind of like Google. We're not going to ever require anyone to be in the office 5 days a week unless it's an office where that's very culturally relevant, where people want to be there in certain parts of the world. We expect people to work in different places, but we also expect managers to lead in a different way. We're going to continue to focus on sort of well-being and mental health, which I'm happy to talk more about, but that's a whole other area of focus we've had. And then the only other thing I would say about one of the things we've really over-indexed on is culture. Levi's has a very strong brand, very strong set of values. We are very outspoken in the world about what we believe in. We are not afraid to advocate for what we believe in. We were pioneers in some of the most recent voting activities in the US, things like that, and encouraging other employers to give their employees time off to vote. So we have leaned in heavily and over-indexed on that, so that, because that was what we were worried was going to get lost by not being together, right? So we do more of that, more communications, more virtual events. You know, our CEO literally talks to the whole company full open forum every 2 weeks, and I don't think that's going to change. It used to be, I think, a quarterly thing. So I think the two things I would say is really supporting managers, focusing on well-being, and then leaning on our culture.
Yeah. Tracy, can I follow up for a second on the question of burnout, well-being, mental health? Because I think any of us who are listening know this is a problem. We hear it from our employees. It's importantly to be attuned to that and to be empathetic. But I do find myself in conversations where somebody eventually says to me, well, I'm burnt out because your expectations are so high. And if you want me to be less stressed, give me less work. No doubt you've had the same experience. What's the answer to that?
I think we have to reprioritize work. I just do. I mean, I personally think that, and that's actually, I mean, that's what we still struggle with, right? So we are doing everything from a partnership with Thrive Global to give people micro steps. We're providing additional childcare support. We're pulling all the levers we know how to pull, some of this manager work. We give the last Friday of the month off. We're meeting free Friday. So we've made all the structural changes and amplified support mechanisms. And there is still a workload issue, which I don't actually think for us existed before the pandemic. I mean, it existed in spots, and we always have busy season. We're in the middle of, holiday right now. But again, I wasn't here, but I don't think that was a big systemic issue that popped in, say, our employee surveys. Most of us survey employees, and we probably survey around stress to some degree. We have some of that data. And my guess, but I'll speak for Ellis & Co. where I have data, is that workload thing went up during the pandemic. And I think it went up for a couple of reasons. One was truly us. At the beginning, when you're in crisis management, you are in crisis management. And I think people can sprint for a certain amount of time. I think we developed some habits that we then had to unwind around scheduling meetings from 7 or 8 in the morning until 7 at night. That would never happen if people had to commute. I mean, you might have global meetings where you get up earlier, stay up late. We are a very global company, but that just wasn't it wasn't happening because people didn't have, a kid's recital to go to or a doctor's appointment even, or things like that. We were actually filling their time. And that's one of the things we had to tell managers, you have to reprioritize. We also still had all of our aspirations as a company in the middle of the pandemic. So we had to make a hard decision. We're in the middle of a transformation, and we decided to do it differently. We looked at ourselves in August and said, we're burning out this company. We're never going to get there. And we're going to underperform our own aspirations if we don't actually just think about it differently. It's not like we're not going to do it. We're just going to think about it differently. So that's one. The other thing I think we have to be deeply mindful of is human beings work for us, and now they have school under their roofs. They might have 2 working parents under their roofs. I mean, half the jobs, parents are teachers for a big chunk of their day. And that was not the job they had 9 months ago, right? And so we can't just say, well, that's not my problem because you work for me. That is not, that's just not a recipe for anyone staying with you, and they can go get another job when the market opens up. And it's not realistic. So yes. I think we also had to be very realistic about making it okay for an employee to say, I can't be on a call until 9 a.m. or 9:30 because I have to get my kids set up on their Zoom meeting. Right. So I think it's both of those. But what I think is a blessing of this time is it's going to force us as employers to be much more realistic about what it means to be productive, the productivity you can have, but also realizing that humans are humans who have other priorities in their life, and that's okay too.
Yeah. Anybody on the panel want to talk about the burnout issue? I don't know, Raj, if that was something you looked at. And Jenny, could Jenny go ahead?
I was just going to say one thing that we looked at, we are a big, very inclusive company. But then when we kind of got under the covers, we're looking at, our meeting that decides on priorities for operation and technology would have 100 people on it. Well, guess what? 100 people aren't adding value to that meeting. Probably 85 of them are getting an update. And again, this is that people process piece, which is actually saying, let's create, some guidelines around what types of meetings you have, what's the objective, who attends, and if it's an update, we'll have a forum to update. And somebody asked the question of what tools. I mean, we do a lot with Microsoft Teams. It's very similar to Slack, where you can create channels for groups that are just all feeding it, and it is a great forum for update. But you have to have somebody sort of managing a bit of what the guidelines are on it, so that like a library. If you walked in without Dewey Decimal System, you'd never find a book. So there is some organizational that goes into it, but I think a lot of big companies have way too many meetings.
Yeah, yeah. The meeting challenge is definitely one that needs to be gotten under control. Amy Christensen, you had an interesting question, and I think Brian has some thoughts on it as well. So you want to repeat your question for the group? Can I get you to come on camera and identify yourself and ask the question?
Raj, did you want to add anything? I think Raj had his hand up on that last point, Alan.
Oh, sorry, Raj, go ahead.
That's okay. I can come later, Alan, if you want me to.
Why don't you go ahead and add, and then we'll go to Amy.
Okay, so very quickly, I just wanted to add one point to the burnout question. So, I think the elegant solution that I've been thinking about a lot and doing research on is, why do we have burnout? Because we have so many calls. And so these Zoom calls could be replaced by this asynchronous way of working. And some of my research points out that you could use the Slack channel not only to communicate, but to also take decisions. And the beauty of that model is then all the rationale for that decision is codified forever. And a new hire joining 6 months from today could go and read that rationale. That's the first reason. And the second reason is, if we are not doing a meeting like this, but we are communicating on Slack, it makes people more thoughtful. You get time to do more deep thinking. You don't have to react to everything in the minute. But the last thing I'll say, Alan, is this also means that managers need to reorient their expectations. You can't grab the phone, pick it up, and ask questions and demand answers in the minute. You have to become comfortable with posting a question, letting the person think, wake up in his time zone or her time zone, and respond to you.
Yeah, great. Amy, can we go to you now for your question? I think you're muted. All right, you know what I'll do? I'll make it easy for you.
I'm done.
Okay,
Sorry.
Good. Go ahead.
I just had a question about, you talked about the middle managers and the belonging aspect of what's going on with them and the networking, and I think that's a great idea. But are there other things that we can do about the middle management group? Because we definitely see that struggling in our company, as far as they're kind of sandwiched between a lot of communication at the senior level and then the individual contributors. And how do we help them?
And tell everyone what your company is.
Mutual of Omaha.
Yep. Brian, you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, just a couple of things that we've done internally at Slack in particular. So one, in terms of the networking side, is set it up for them. So some of the groups have actually intentionally designed and built opportunities for middle managers in specific functions to get together, because those hallway bumps into each other weren't happening. So by intentionally actually building it, you're finding ways for them to compare cases and talk about, like, how are they managing someone who needs, flexibility right now, but maybe struggling with performance. And the second is, don't be afraid to get super tactical with people, because, when it comes, like Tracy was talking about the challenge of prioritization, the challenge gets doubled if your middle managers aren't, like, every week going through and doing the one-on-one that says, what are the priorities on each individual's plate, and are they achievable or not? Because if you wait until, that person's coming to you as a manager saying, I can't possibly keep up with the load, it's too late to make adjustments. But if you can combine, like, really good, clear habits of, I want all my middle managers to do one-on-ones with their team and know explicitly what their priorities are and if they're achievable every week, it doesn't have the same problem of somebody saying no that happens otherwise. And then the second trick is to take that same tactic, but then, to Raj's point, share those priorities in the broadest public forum you possibly can, because that's what gets the transparency out there. So if your team knows what the priorities are overall for the team and what the individual's priorities are, it just gets the guesswork out of it, and everybody kind of understands what's going on. So the private conversation about your workload and then the public conversation about priorities just helps reduce the stress level. And what we found, at least, is middle managers really need that sort of tactical, intentional building blocks to be successful.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian. Frida Polly, I see you active in the chat here. Did you want to add something to the discussion? I did see you active in the chat. Now I don't see you. We may have lost Frida. Oh, there. Frida, can you hear me? Okay. So who else wants in on this conversation? let me then go back to the panel, and let's get super tactical here. If you think about the challenges we've been talking about, you think about what you've learned from your own research and your own experience, and you think about what the world's going to look like a year and a half down the road. What are the 1, 2, 3 pieces of advice that you would give to someone trying to navigate this? And I'll let you go in any order you want to. Who wants to take that on first? Darren?
Sure. I think you're going to see a lot of second and third order effects from this migration. You're already starting to see some of that. If I were someone on the receiving end of this transition, the first thing I would do is ask myself, what could my life look like if I didn't assume that things had to be the way they were? So from a management standpoint, what this means is people are going to start thinking about optimizing their life for something other than a commutable distance to an office. They could optimize their life for access to nature, better air quality, a certain school that they may prefer their children to be in, near parents for elder caregiving, any number of things that could bring them great personal fulfillment that, if empowered and enabled, will certainly pour over into increased loyalty, retention, and productivity in the workplace. So leaders should be prepared to do everything they can to empower and enable that. And also, on the point of democratization, I think you will see many more people having the confidence to show up in an initial interview and ask, what's your stance on workplace flexibility? For many years, this question has been reserved for those with great privilege. And in history of working in distributed environments, you essentially had to lobby for it and prove yourself, because almost no senior level roles were actually advertised as remote. Now, people are going to feel like they are entitled to an answer for that. And I think the great litmus test of this will be Glassdoor reviews. You're going to see companies that invest in supporting people and supporting work, and it's going to be location agnostic, and you're going to see their ratings go up, because it's pretty hard to top the perk of global flexibility and autonomy. And then you will see other organizations that attempt to bury their heads in the sand and not really pay attention to this change, and the culture will be negatively impacted. And given enough time, the business will be negatively impacted as well. They won't be able to recruit top talent, and they won't be able to be as efficient as their competitors are.
Darren, I'm glad we let you go first, because I think you're staking out the extreme position on this topic. I mean, we hear so many corporate leaders out there. I already mentioned the Google announcement this morning, expect you to be in the office 3 days a week. You've heard Reed Hastings of Netflix. I've heard from companies like Raytheon, Johnson & Johnson, a sense that something is lost by not having easy access to personal interaction. And so, okay, you can work from home a couple of days a week, but we want you in the office part of the time. You think that's a mistake?
Oh, of course. It's going to massively impact their ability to retain talent. If people don't already love living near the office that they're living in, the first thing they're going to do is polish up their resume. I mean, this is people's lives. You cannot put this genie back in the bottle. Now that people realize that in some roles and in some industries, their job can be done effectively from anywhere in the world, people are going to try to take advantage of that, as they should. Now, I won't say that it's not going to be difficult. In the case of Netflix, they're making content and films. It's going to be pretty difficult to remotely create the next Star Wars. Fair. There will be some roles that actually do happen better and more effectively and efficiently in person. That's not an argument. This isn't an us versus them. This is a conversation about integrating additional flexibility into the workplace. So even with high touch industries like making a film, this used to be a binary discussion, but now it's not. On the filmmaking team, the legal team, the comms team, and the finance team, they can all work remotely. Now, the actors may need to show up in front of the camera at some point, but it's not an all or nothing approach anymore. And the most progressive companies are going to realize that and add flexibility where they can, because the top talent will demand it.
Yeah. Jenny, what are your most practical takeaways from this?
So, I mean, in the investment business, your CIO of an investment team is absolute king, right? So they get to decide what their investment process. So I had this conversation. We probably have 20 independent teams, and I said, look, don't wait for me to tell you how to run your business. We'll come up with the corporate sort of view, but each of you as CIOs, you decide what that process and what it's going to look like. But I want you to think about a couple of things. And first of all, the reaction, which my view, was if you were a command and control, everybody work together, you will come up with 100 reasons why this is the only way this investment process could happen, right? Now, the pushback, which I said to a couple of them that are based in New York, is, so let's just think about this. The average New Yorker commutes 90 minutes. That's 3 hours a day. They're working out, they're sleeping, and they're spending more time with their family. And the future, right? Because I think you have to push COVID behind you. The future is your kids aren't going to all be home and you have to be the dual, teacher. The future is you're going to have that time home. So if you run your investment team that way, your competitor is going to come after your best guy and say, where would you like to work? And if you can't think today, and my message to them, which was probably 6 months ago, was use this time to push the envelope on how you can flexibly work so that you're the one who's actually recruiting from your competitors the best talent to make sure that you can be as flexible. So we did a survey in one of our groups. 5% of the people said they're dying to get back to the office, 43% that said they want to do a hybrid, and the rest said, I want to work from home permanently. So, if that's kind of the message, and you aren't a company, because the technology tools exist, if you aren't a company thinking about how you're going to accommodate, and by the way, the extroverts are dying to get back to the office. So there's a segment that actually really likes that environment. But if you can't accommodate your talent, others will be able to recruit away. That's my view.
Yeah. Raj.
So first off, I totally agree with everything Jenny said. So just a couple of reflections. So first, I on my practical insight on how to manage this transformation effectively. So I totally love all remote companies, and I study not only GitLab but other all remote companies. But I also realize that in the interim, hybrid is going to be important in many organizations. However, I don't like the 3-2-2 model. And for the precise reason that it doesn't allow you to leave that geographic location. So you can't work from anywhere. So a much better creative alternative that I'm studying right now is one that TCS, which is the world's largest IT service company with 500,000 employees, announced. And their model is what they call 25% remote. What that means is every single employee, starting from the CEO down to the intern, will only be 25% remote. And that is it. Not 26, not 27, not 24, which means that the senior managers, the middle managers, the interns, the entry-level people all will do it. But then you, as an individual with your team, decide what is 25%. Is it 1 day a week? Is it 1 week a month? Is it like a burst of 2-3 weeks and then you go off? And that really enables work from anywhere. So that's the first thing I would say. Relatedly, the hybrid model where the C-suite is still physical is doomed for failure, because then all the middle managers will show up at that office for FaceTime. So this has to be practiced top down. This has to be embraced by the CEO and the C-suite. And then in terms of my predictions, Alan, about what I expect to see in 18 months, to Jenny's point, I expect in every industry, some companies to manage this transformation better, and they are going to have a leg up in the talent game in every industry. I've been talking almost every day to boards and CEOs across industries, and this is now becoming a first order issue across industries. So this is going to be a mechanism to attract and retain talent. And my last prediction is that this whole work from anywhere movement will now help talent move back to smaller towns in Middle America and all over the world. So we'll see this return migration from the coasts to places which have lost talent for years and years and decades. And this is going to be great for society. So, I've been working with the Tulsa remote folks who have been attracting remote workers for 3 years to Tulsa, Oklahoma. There are programs in Arkansas and Arizona now. I honestly feel work from anywhere could do great benefit for society if it's allowed by multiple companies.
Yeah. Wayne Davis, you raised an interesting question about tax consequences. I wonder if you could share that.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, got it.
You can hear me? Thank you. Yeah, I think someone prior to me, maybe it was Tracy, that raised that as employees work across states or counties. And in my company, Comcast NBC, we now have employees who want to work internationally. Our payroll organizations are finding it very, very difficult to be able to track and manage from administrative perspective the tax laws and tax challenges of remote workers in different counties or states. We have put some guidelines in place to try to restrict those types of situations and scenarios, but under the concept of work anywhere, certainly there will probably need to be some types of breakthroughs to help companies figure out how to work through that.
Yeah, it's a serious challenge. If you can work from anywhere, choose to work from the place that has the largest social safety net, and as a result also the highest taxes, and how is that going to work?
Absolutely.
It's a really good point. Grace Zinsick, you were here in the chat as well. Can I call on you, Grace?
Sure. I was raising some observations. I just first want to compliment Tracy for all the great work at Levi. We're very similar businesses. A lot of what we've done is similar. I won't go on about that. Just a couple of observations. I'm curious to hear people's thoughts. The number of calls that we have to have for alignment purposes, I'm curious if others are having that same issue. Raj, I think it's difficult to get alignment over chat on some of these very complex issues, but I think that over-indexing on alignment with leadership on various topics is something that was probably always needed, but will follow with COVID. And I think it's something that's causing the burnout and the stress with middle managers that are involved in those discussions. The second observation I'll add and just share with the group is I think next year will be all about growth. So as this year was focused on survival for many people, literally day by day with managing childcare, managing elderly parents, managing the fear and the worry and anxieties of life, I think that many people feel that they've come through on the other side of it and they want to live the life that they want to live. And so how employers can connect with that in a very deep way and make sure each employee sees their role in the future direction of the company and being very clear about the future direction of your business is important. And I think we'll play that out with remote work and special requests and different things that come to bear. But I just have this feeling it's going to be a big theme.
Yeah.
Love to hear what others think.
Yeah. Before we do that, Grace, and just for everyone's benefit, Grace is is Chief People Officer for Chobani, which is a great people
Yes. Oh, I failed to mention that. That's where I work.
a great people organization, but also an organization, in these conversations about the future of work, we tend to obsess about the knowledge worker. And right. You got a lot of workers who are not knowledge workers and don't have this option. And I wonder how you think about the potential two-tier ramifications of the changes we've been talking about for the last hour.
I think it's a brilliant question. 70% of our workforce is hourly in the field, and then another percentage of the 30% is essentially in the field. They're performing the job duties of a broker model. They're at the stores. We spend probably a disproportionate amount of time focused on them. We need to get our remote work thinking kind of further along. We've delayed our reopening of the offices until June. But I think the inequities are real. I mean, I think companies either have to decide that they're going to put their foot down on issues like benefits, leave policies, same for all, or are you going to have corporate frontline differences? I mean, some companies have already made their mind up on that decision, but certainly to Alan's brilliant point, the further we go along in this workplace flexibility, have whatever you want for the corporate side, you exacerbate the divide. So we think about that all the time. And I love that you raised it, Alan. I think it's really important. And we're all dealing with it in some way. We all have entry frontline workers in our workforce. It's just whether or not they make up as much of the percentage as they do for us and for Levi too, that I know, Tracy, you guys care deeply about this issue as well.
Yeah, well, the purpose of these conversations really is to identify the issues that we need to drill down into deeper,
right?
And help identify issues that Future Forum can take on with its research or further discussions. Brian, I don't know if you want to comment on what you've heard so far, there's a lot of grist for the Future Forum mill here.
Yeah, I think, Grace, you're spot on. I mean, the challenges aren't just knowledge worker challenges. They're honestly easier to resolve in some ways because you can get people working, remotely in their homes, and they still have the challenges of childcare and illness and everything else. We are trying to dig in. We're seeing people do different things in terms of how you enable frontline worker flexibility as well, whether that's easier way for people to split shifts, easier way for people to swap shifts across work, staffing flex. But there's a number of things that are going to have to be worked out because this is going to be with us for a while. And being cautious about like how far apart you let those divides grow across your company. But flexibility still has to be installed on the non-knowledge worker side of the world as well if we're going to be effective in this.
Great. I want to thank Raj and Jenny and Darren for your contributions and helping us lead this conversation here today. It's been really valuable. Of course, want to thank the Future Forum by Slack for its partnership. I need a Fortune manager on the call because I realized that I didn't say at the beginning of this conversation, as we habitually do, whether this is on the record or off the record. Can someone answer that for me?
We are on the record.
Excellent. If anybody has an objection, if anybody said anything that, and because I didn't say it at the outset, if you have an objection to that, please shoot me a note right after this, alan.murray@fortune.com, and I'll honor your request. We should have made that clear at the beginning. And then mark your calendars for Wednesday, February 24th, 1 p.m. Eastern. We have a 3-hour gathering with a slew of sessions designed to dig into the most important aspects of this conversation, and also interactive roundtable conversations. All of this is with the goal of helping light the way to a future that's clear from this conversation is going to be very different, and we all want to make sure we get it right. Thank you again for being here, and thanks for engaging in the conversation.